I heard a story this week of a man who walked into his local library and asked the librarian where the self-help section was. The librarian looked at the man with a look of disdain and said, "Well, if I told you that, it would defeat the purpose." Think about it a moment. Of course, with the wealth of self-help books on offer, finding the section in any library or bookshop is not a difficult thing. It's estimated that the self-help industry is worth in excess of $10 billion a year. I suspect that most of us have got some kind of self-help book gathering dust on our shelves. And just for fun, I Googled some of the most bizarre titles for self-help books. How about some of these? How to Write a How to Write Book. Do you like that? Or How to Survive a Robot Uprising. Subtitle, Tips on Defending Yourself Against the Coming Rebellion. Whoa. Or this is my personal favourite, How to Knit with Cat Hair. Boggles the mind, doesn't it? Now, we may not all want to develop that crucial life skill, but I guess we all want to be the best version of ourselves we can, don't we? Yes? When we heard that reading from Ephesians, maybe like me, it felt and sounded a little bit like Paul giving us some self-help advice. Do you think? Instructions for Christian living, it says in my NIV study Bible. But here's the thing. This is not a self-help book. Sure, it will help you. If you have issues with anger, it can help you. Not the kind of anger you get when you see something that is just not right and you want to do something about it. That's evidence that the Holy Spirit is at work in your life, sensitizing you to the things that hurt the heart of God. It's not that kind of anger, but the kind of anger that comes with unresolved conflicts. If that is your problem, then this book can help. If your problem is unwholesome talk or dishonesty, then this book can help. But friends, this is not a self-help book. You see, I think we tend to think a little bit like that librarian. We think we need to help ourselves, and frankly, to ask for help is a sign of weakness. Now, don't get me wrong. Does this book say that we need to invest in our own personal and spiritual health and well-being? It does. Yes, it does. But friends, this book is not a self-help book. What this book does, and this letter of Paul's in particular does, is to identify a problem. And it's a problem that we all need help with. I don't mean the surface problems, like a potty mouth, or anger that rises up when we just don't know where it came from. What Paul is talking about here is the problem from which these things flow. Listen to what he says. So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do. And by Gentiles, he's talking about those who don't believe. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to this, the hardening of their hearts. We all know that physically the hardening of our hearts can be fatal. It's responsible for more than 73,000 deaths in the UK each year. About 1 in 6 men and 1 in 10 women die from coronary heart disease. But there's parallels with the spiritual realm too. We see the effects of hardened hearts in the attitude of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Speaking to the scribes, Jesus says at one point, "Why do you think bad thoughts in your hearts? Thoughts of jealousy, resentment, and unbelief." But it's not just first century Jewish leaders that struggle with a problem of hardened hearts. It can be our problem too. Hardened hearts is what separates us from God, and it's what separates us from each other. And that's where this book differs from any self-help book that you can get. Because it doesn't say that our strength Our help comes from deep within us. If only we could meditate on being the best that we can be, or be better at knitting cat hair. No, it says help comes from beyond ourselves. Our help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, the one whose image we are made. Yes, we can maintain a healthy heart by getting rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, but the starting point for recognizing that our motivation for ridding ourselves of these things is important. Our motivation for forgiving each other is important, and that is because Christ first forgave you. He first forgave me. Paul says to have a spiritually fit heart is to bring our own sickness to Jesus, to allow him to heal us and to give us a new heart and a new attitude. Paul puts it this way: to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Wow. The language that Paul uses here should remind us of the liturgy that we will use next week at Angus's baptism. Because Paul is speaking here in the context of baptism. One of the highlights for me last year was the privilege and the joy of baptizing a group of young adults and older children, including Yan Ling. What a joy it was. A new beginning, a new start. And what we recall when we are baptized as new followers of Jesus is this: that the starting point for the Christian life is not what you can do for yourself. Baptism is described as an outward sign of an inward grace. In other words, it's a way of expressing what God has done for us that we could not do for ourselves. This is ground zero for the Christian life. Everything that our lives stood for before is stripped away in order for God to begin rebuilding. And friends, none of us can bypass this gift of grace. It's only when we've allowed God to do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves that we can begin the process of growing into this new way of living. Over this next few weeks, I suspect a lot of us parents will be kitting our kids out for the new school term. It can be a rather expensive exercise. When I was growing up, my mum had great vision when it came to buying school uniform. When I say she had great vision, what I mean by that is that she bought my school blazers very much with an eye to not what size I was when it was being fitted, but with an eye to what size I would be closer to the end of my academic career. For the first few years or so, my school blazer resembled more an overcoat than a blazer. People didn't realise I had hands until about year 3. And when Paul talks about the Christian life, he uses the illustration of putting on new clothes. To put on the new self, created to be like God. And like my school blazer, this new clothing has two particular features. The first is that it works like a uniform. It marks us out as having a new identity. We no longer live for ourselves. We belong to Christ and we live for him. And our attitudes and our behaviours should increasingly reflect this new identity. The second is this: it may take some getting used to. We need to grow into it. It's a process of change and transformation, which the great reformer Martin Luther described this way: this life, therefore, is not godliness, but the process of becoming godly. It is not health, but getting well. Not being, but becoming. Not rest, but exercise. We are not now what we shall be, but we are on the way. The process is not yet finished, but it is actively going on. This is not the end, but it is the road. At present, everything does not gleam and sparkle, but everything is being purified. Do you like that? Or to put it more simply, you and I, in God's hands, are a work in progress. Not only personally, but as a church, we are a work in progress. Does that process, that journey, require individual, personal effort? Yeah, it does. But crucially, whilst this process of growth is personal, it's not private. Sometimes people would describe their faith as a private affair. And I want to lovingly but firmly say to them that our faith may be personal, but it can never be private. Look at what Paul says for a second. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbour. Why? For we are all members of one body. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work. Why? In order that they may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. Why? Because our aim should be to build others up according to their need. Whenever Paul talks about what it is to live the Christian life, he uses together language. The family, the body, how we relate to one another. Of course, the challenge for us is that we live in a culture that is very individualistic. But Paul, writing to the Ephesians, was writing to a very different culture. If you visit one of the ancient sites like Ephesus, one of the most popular selfies that most modern tourists take is of themselves sitting on the communal latrines. And now that might seem strange, but it's because the latrines themselves are rather odd to our modern eye. 10 toilets all lined up in a row, not a cubicle or a partition in sight. Instead, they met in communal baths and latrines. Day-to-day life was lived out in community. It was a community project. A bit like camping at New Wine, as I did last week. So it would come as no surprise to them that Paul taught them that their Christian lives were to be lived out, worked out in community. Is that sometimes complex and messy? Yes, it is. So what does this mean for us? Well, firstly, I would say don't panic. I'm not proposing that we take down the partitions in our loos to help us do community better. That's not one of the improvements we're planning. But what I am saying, and Paul reminds us of, is this. We do not grow, friends, in isolation. We grow in community, in relationship. And yes, that can be messy. We need to work at our relationships with one another. We need to keep short accounts. Don't let the sun go down on our anger. Don't let resentments build up. If you're new to church, you might have wondered what this strange thing is of passing the peace, where everybody sort of goes around and kind of hugs each other. What's that all about? Well, you know, the purpose of the peace is for us to be in a right place of relationship with one another. We're about to come and share communion together. At communion, we remember what God has done for us, the grace that he's poured out for us, the forgiveness that he's shown us. And when we share the peace, we are providing an opportunity to be in a place of right relationship with each other. Will you grow within the community? Are you part of what's happening in this community, the exciting things that God is doing? Are you part of the 120 plus people that are part of home groups here? Or have you sort of kept that at a distance? Is that something that you need to explore? So we need to think about growing in community. Secondly, I think Paul wants to challenge us about where our starting point is for this process. Are we still thinking this Christian stuff is about how we can improve ourselves? Maybe we need to go back to ground zero. Back to where it all begins. You know, baptism is a wonderful thing. It's the place where we can remember that it's not what we can do for ourselves, but it's what God has already done for us. Were you baptized as an infant and didn't really get explained what it was that happened to you? Do you need to reaffirm those baptism vows? Maybe you've never been baptized. And God is nudging you this morning to take the step that Yan Ling took last year and to say, I want to identify myself as a follower of Jesus and begin that process, that journey of change, an outward sign of an inward grace. Amen.